we've been getting a lot of calls from other agents, other brokers, and saying that, hey, if we don't know how much your seller is willing to pay towards buyer agency compensation, we're just, we're not going to show your property, or we're going to discuss this, which they should do, is discuss it with their buyer. But at the end of the day, there doesn't have to be all of that anxiety. The reason is, once you sign and enter into that agreement with that buyer, you have a fiduciary responsibility to that buyer. So you can't just say, I'm not going to show you this property because I'm not going to be able to cover the buyer agency compensation because the seller is unwilling to contribute. You can't say that. You have a fiduciary responsibility to your buyer, so it's your buyer's choice at that point. But what both parties need to understand is, when we're negotiating compensation or even concessions in the offer, you don't have to accept it. Like, a buyer could still say, and they could still, put an offer in front of a seller, ask for X number of dollars towards their compensation. And if they're unable to negotiate what they need to make that deal go through, it's okay. They don't have to accept any counter from the seller, right? So there doesn't have to be all the anxiety that there is.
No,
currently.
I mean, if it gets to the point where the concessions aren't met,
Yeah.
and the buyer agrees that this isn't the best house for me to pursue, it's no different than when a VA buyer, for an example, a VA buyer says, hey, I don't have a lot of cash, but I'd like to go $0 down. And the lender says, okay, you can ask for contribution from the seller that will cover your closing costs. And so the VA buyer is a buyer for the home as long as two things happen.
Yeah.
The seller accepts their sales price and makes the contribution to their closing costs. Now they're a buyer for that home, because now they can perform and go to settlement. If the seller says, no, I'm not going to contribute towards your closing costs, that's going to be your responsibility, and the buyer doesn't have the finances to do that, then they wouldn't be able to buy the home. They wouldn't be able to perform, so they wouldn't ratify or agree to that change.
Yeah, and even if there is a seller out there who says, I'm not willing to compensate a buyer's agent, I would say put your offer forward, because you and I have been dealing with buyers and sellers for 3 decades now, and there's something to be said for, hey, there's an offer in front of me, right? And what they say initially without the offer in front of them is very different than what they ultimately end up doing.